Everything you were told about fear is backwards. The ones called terrifying weren't trying to be feared. They were surviving something bigger. Empires labeled them dangerous. But what if that label was a cover? What if the fear wasn't about who they were, but what they refused to become? Because once you see who is really afraid, you can't unsee it. For centuries, Native American nations stood against Spanish, Mexican, and American expansion in what became known as the American Indian Wars. But the word feared did not come from nowhere. It came from soldiers who lost battles, settlers who lived in constant uncertainty, and empires that struggled to control land they thought would be easy to take. What history often calls fear was something deeper: strategy, resistance, survival. Number 1. Comanche, the empire that stopped expansion. The Comanche were not just warriors. They were a powerful force that shaped the fate of an entire region. At their peak, they controlled a vast territory known as Comancheria, stretching across what is now Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. This was not a small or scattered presence. It was an organized and dominant space where they set the rules, controlled movement, and defended their way of life. For more than a century, they resisted outside forces. Spanish colonizers, Mexican armies, and later American expansion all tried to push into their lands. Again and again, those efforts failed or came at a heavy cost. One of the key reasons was their unmatched skill on horseback. The Comanche were among the finest horse riders in the world. They could travel long distances quickly, strike with precision, and vanish before their enemies even had time to react. Their speed and coordination made traditional armies ineffective against them. They did not fight in predictable ways. They adapted. They observed. They controlled the rhythm of every encounter. They moved faster. They struck harder. And they were gone before resistance could form. This was not random violence. It was strategy. It was power. It was control. Number 2. Apache, masters of guerrilla warfare. The Apache became one of the most feared groups across North America for one clear reason. They understood the land in a way their enemies never could. The deserts, the mountains, the harsh and unforgiving terrain that others struggled to survive in. The Apache moved through it with confidence. It was not just where they lived. It was part of how they fought. They relied on stealth, surprise, and precise timing. Instead of facing large armies head-on, they chose when and where to strike. They used ambushes, sudden attacks, and quick retreats to keep their enemies constantly off balance. By the time opposing forces tried to respond, the Apache were already gone. They turned the environment into an advantage. Every canyon, every ridge, every hidden path became part of their strategy. Leaders like Geronimo and Cochise carried this resistance across generations. Their leadership was not just about fighting. It was about endurance, patience, and refusing to give up their land and way of life. What made their story even more remarkable is who they fought. Not just one power, not just one era. They resisted 3 different forces over time: Spain, Mexico, and the United States. Each came with armies, resources, and plans to take control. And none of them found it easy. Because the Apache were not just fighting battles. They were controlling the fight itself. It's important to understand this clearly. The idea of these tribes being feared comes largely from historical records written by settlers, soldiers, and colonial governments. These accounts often focused on conflict, survival, and loss. They do not fully represent the cultures, values, or everyday lives of these nations. What you're seeing here is one side of a much larger story. Number 3. Sioux, the force that defeated an army. The Sioux were not just another group on the plains. They were a dominant force during the conflicts known as the Plains Indian Wars, with a presence that could not be ignored. Their strength did not come from numbers alone. It came from unity, from mobility, and from a deeply rooted warrior culture that shaped how they lived and fought. They moved together. They fought with purpose, and they understood the land as both home and advantage. That strength became impossible to deny during the Battle of the Little Bighorn. In that moment, a United States Army force led by George Armstrong Custer faced a coalition of Sioux and their allies. What followed shocked the nation. Custer and his forces were completely defeated. It was not a narrow loss. It was decisive, one of the most stunning defeats in American military history. But this moment was more than just a victory. It sent a message that challenged what many believed at the time. These nations were not weak. They were not disorganized. And they were not going to be pushed aside without resistance. They were capable. They were strategic. And they were not losing easily. Number 4. Cheyenne Dog Soldiers, warriors without retreat. Among the Cheyenne, there existed a powerful warrior society known as the Dog Soldiers. They were not just fighters. They were bound by a code that demanded courage, discipline, and loyalty beyond fear. This was not about individual glory. It was about responsibility to the group, to their people, and to the role they had sworn to uphold. In battle, that commitment became visible in a way few could ignore. Some dog soldiers would stake themselves to the ground using a sash tied to a peg. Once anchored, they made a decision that could not be undone. They would not retreat, no matter how intense the battle became. No matter how the odds shifted, they held their position. To those facing them, this was more than intimidating. It was deeply unsettling, because they were not fighting with the intention of simply surviving or winning in the usual sense. They were fighting with absolute commitment. A level of resolve that changed how battles felt, how enemies reacted, and how their presence was remembered. This was not reckless behavior. It was discipline taken to its highest form. A declaration that some lines would not be crossed, and some positions would never be abandoned. Number 5. Mohawk, power of the Iroquois Confederacy. The Mohawk were not just a single nation standing alone. They were part of a larger and highly organized alliance known as the Iroquois Confederacy. This confederacy brought together multiple nations under a unified system that allowed them to act with coordination and strength. It was not a loose connection. It was a structured alliance built on shared decisions, mutual defense, and long-term strategy. Within this system, the Mohawk held a critical position. They were often seen as the Eastern Guardians of the Confederacy, playing a key role in both defense and expansion. For centuries, this alliance dominated large parts of the northeastern region of North America. Their influence shaped trade, diplomacy, and conflict across a wide area. Their approach to warfare was not random or disorganized. It was disciplined, it was strategic, and it was carefully coordinated. They planned, they communicated, and they acted with purpose. Both neighboring tribes and colonial forces came to understand one thing clearly. Facing the Mohawk did not mean facing a single group. It meant confronting a system of warfare and alliance that had already proven its strength over generations, and that made them one of the most formidable forces in the region. Number 6. Seminole, the tribe that would not surrender. In the swamps of Florida, the Seminole fought a very different kind of war. It was not fought on open plains or in large formations. It was fought in dense wetlands, hidden paths, and terrain that outsiders could barely navigate. And in that environment, the Seminole held the advantage. They turned the land into their greatest weapon. The swamps, the heat, the thick vegetation all became part of how they resisted. Movement was difficult for invading forces, but for the Seminole, it was familiar ground. They knew where to move, where to hide, and when to strike. This way of fighting made them incredibly difficult to defeat. Their resistance became most visible during a series of conflicts known as the Seminole Wars. Again and again, United States forces attempted to remove them. Again and again, the Seminole resisted. They did not rely on large, direct battles. They relied on patience, on timing, on using the environment to wear their enemies down. But what truly defined them was not just how they fought. It was what they refused to do. They refused to sign away their future. They refused to give up their land. And most importantly, they refused to disappear. Even under pressure, even after years of conflict, they endured, not by chance, but by choice. Number 7. Blackfoot, defenders of the Northern Plains. The Blackfoot were not a small or isolated group. They were a powerful presence across a vast region, controlling large areas of what is now Montana and parts of Canada. This was not just land they occupied. It was territory they actively protected. Between the early and mid-1800s, they stood as defenders of the Northern Plains, facing pressure from multiple directions. Rival tribes competed for resources and influence, while incoming settlers pushed steadily into their lands. The Blackfoot did not yield easily. They responded with strength and determination, building a reputation for fierce and decisive defense. Their approach to conflict was direct. They protected their borders, they guarded their resources, and they made it clear that their territory was not open for the taking. Because of this, They became one of the dominant forces of the northern plains. Their presence shaped how others moved, where they settled, and what risks they were willing to take. Crossing into Blackfoot territory was never a casual decision. It was understood as a serious risk, because once you entered their land, you were no longer in control of what happened next. But here's what changes everything. Much of this fear was recorded by those on the outside: soldiers, settlers, colonial governments, and their stories often focused on what they experienced, not always why it was happening, because what looked like aggression was often resistance, what looked like chaos was often strategy, and what was called fear was sometimes respect, written in a different language. The deeper fear, the Wendigo. Beyond the battlefield, there was another kind of fear, not from warriors, but from within. In Algonquin traditions, the Wendigo was not just a monster. It was a warning, a symbol of greed, endless hunger, and the loss of humanity. While warriors threatened the body, the Wendigo warned about the soul, because sometimes the greatest threat is not the enemy outside. It is what people can become. Closing reflection. So when history calls these nations feared, you have to ask a different question. Feared by who? Because from another perspective, these were not just warriors. They were protectors of land, defenders of identity, and people who refused to let their world be erased without a fight. And that changes the story completely. Thanks for watching. Mode Hub Tales brings untold history to life. Subscribe now to uncover more hidden stories that shaped the world.